Hello, and welcome to the U.S. History Underground. I'm your host, Mr. Zagari, and as usual, I'm joined by my partner in historical crime, Mr. O'Hagan. How are things going today, Mr. O?
I'm doing great, Zags. I'm especially excited for today's topic. As we get closer to the AP exam and the Regents exam, it's always a good idea to discuss topics that cover a longer period of time, right? That 20 or 30-year bridge that both the state and the AP like to cover. So something that could show up as a DBQ or LEQ or civic literacy essay. And I think foreign policy always is an essay-friendly topic. And Cold War policy is especially important, I think, because we're still living with the remnants and effects of the Cold War in the 21st century.
So true. We are going to look at a very specific part of that Cold War policy that was characterized by an attempt to improve our relationship with the Soviets and relieve some of the tensions that made the Cold War so stressful. Today on the podcast, détente. Our inspiration for today's podcast came from a conference that Mr. O'Hagan and I recently attended at the Museum of American Armor over in Plainview. It's a great place for any of you military history nerds out there.
No doubt. 2 thumbs up, especially if you love the smell of diesel fuel, as Mr. Zagari does.
It's my own cologne,
You're
said. That conference was sponsored by the people at Teaching American History, a nonprofit organization that provides educational support and programs focused on the evolution of Cold War policy. It was led by Dr. Eric Pullen, whose observations we are going to lean on throughout this podcast.
Shout out to Dr. Pullen. Hope he listens to the podcast.
Yeah.
But we could also put a little blame on him, Zags, for providing us with such an in-depth and rich resource that we decided we had to split this podcast into 2 parts. So, and that way we can stick to our normal 10 to 12 minutes. Sure. So don't forget to join us for part 2 of the podcast. It'll be worth it. Zags, can you give us a starting point for talking about détente?
Sure. Détente is a broad term that is often used by historians to describe U.S. foreign policy that focused on 2 major components: a relaxation of tensions, which is what the word literally translates to in French, and an effort to minimize the use of nuclear weapons. But it's more complicated than that, isn't it, Mr. O'Hagan?
It sure is, Zags. Different presidential administrations will attempt to relax those tensions, but they don't all call it détente. Not all the administrations negotiate the same way. Different administrations emphasize different issues. So it's far from a cohesive policy that will be followed from one president to the next.
So why don't we try to provide some structure to this disorganized topic? Let us frame our discussion in 3 parts. The 60s, Kennedy and Johnson; the 70s, Nixon, Ford, and Carter; and the 80s, Reagan. The last part on Reagan, that's what we're going to cover in our second podcast. But first, let's get a bit of context. We are the context guys.
We are. So I'm going to skip quite a bit because our audience does have a good background, Zags, in Cold War policy from the end of World War II in 1945. Suffice to say that George Kennan's containment is embraced and expanded as the policy of the day through all these administrations. Push back against the Soviets and communism at every step, ratchet up the tension to make them squirm, support democratic allies, Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, Berlin Airlift, Korea, and on it goes.
And covert operations, too, led by the CIA. Eisenhower gave the green light for actions in Guatemala and Iran. So it's a confrontational approach publicly and privately.
Zags, what's also important here is the concept of monolithic communism. Foreign policy observers of the U.S. government at this time, 45, 50s, right, believed that Moscow was pulling the strings on every other communist government and revolution taking place in the era. And that meant pushing back against those revolutions, and those governments was pushing back against the Soviets. So that's where we are up until the early 1960s. We're locked in an ideological struggle for the soul of the world. Us on one side, the Soviets and all their minions on the other. But another element is added into the mix that complicates everything. What's that additional element, Zags?
The advent of atomic weapons, Mr. O'Hagan. This so-called Cold War has the potential to spark the use of these global killers. It is in this area that political leaders come to grapple with the idea of MAD, or mutually assured destruction. And we are never closer to that endgame than in October of 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis, as it comes to be known, pushes the U.S. and the Soviets to the brink of nuclear war, and it scares them both to death.
Here's our first part, the 1960s. They came close to the launching of those missiles, but it also led the two governments to acknowledge the awesome responsibilities they had to avoid a nuclear war.
It's under Kennedy that the first real détente between the U.S. and the Soviets takes place. Although we have to be careful not to put words in anyone's mouth. Nobody in 1962 would have said détente.
No, they wouldn't.
Following the missile crisis, there was a meeting in Geneva in June of 63. The Soviets and the Americans agreed to a memorandum which will establish a direct communication link between the two governments. As outlined in the memo, this link would comprise of a full-time duplex wired telegraph circuit and a full-time duplex radio telegraph circuit. Not exactly cutting-edge technology in the 21st century, but remember, in 1962, there wasn't any truly reliable way to keep the two governments in touch with one another. I mean, we're not FaceTiming each other about nuclear missile sites.
Right, Zach. And this is where the idea of a hotline or the red phone comes from. All those crisis situations you see in movies and TV shows over the years. Seems overly dramatic to our modern ears. It's the first real acknowledgement that we can't go on having such poor communication between Washington and Moscow. The stakes are too high to begin a nuclear war over a misunderstanding because our leaders couldn't directly communicate in a crisis situation.
And even after Kennedy's death, LBJ will try to continue this more open and communicative relationship with the Soviets. LBJ meets with the Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin in 1967 to negotiate a non-proliferation treaty on anti-ballistic missiles and intercontinental ballistic missiles. Talking point here, this summit took place in the lovely state of New Jersey.
All right, so, we're looking to reduce tension, but we're still not calling it détente, right, Zags?
No, we are not. But it is setting the stage for that policy. It's not until Richard Nixon comes into office that this terminology, détente, is used by American policymakers. Now we are part 2 of our discussion, the 70s. And it's because of many developments taking place in the late 60s and early 70s that this unfolds. This is not going to come as a shock to you to hear, Mr. O'Hagan. Vietnam plays a major role in these developments.
Really? That's so unlike you to think that Vietnam is the linchpin to everything. How'd I do? Did that sound surprised enough?
No, not at all. But I'm giving you a lot to work with here.
All right. Well, tell us why Vietnam ends up being such a turning point in all of this, Sags.
Well, during the Vietnam War, the Americans were trying to negotiate with Ho Chi Minh by using their diplomatic channels in Moscow. Remember, standard operating procedure from the American perspective is that everything communist runs through Moscow. But the Soviets and the Chinese aren't in agreement over the future of revolution and communism. In fact, even though Vietnam has centuries-long standing conflict with the Chinese, Ho Chi Minh relies heavily on the Chinese for diplomatic support and advice during the war and mostly ignores the Soviets.
Right. So this is where American policymakers really come to understand that all communists do not march in the same direction. They don't all follow the same playbook. They really aren't, ready for the word, my friends? They really aren't monolithic.
Very good. Exactly. By the time Nixon comes into office in 69, he and his national security advisor and eventual Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, decide that it's time to try to normalize relations between the Soviets and the United States, and the Chinese and the U.S., and to treat all of these nations as individual players as this big global game.
Right, and this is where Nixon famously goes to China and recognizes the communists as the true government of the nation. He undoubtedly hoped that our cozier relations with the Chinese would drive a sharper wedge between them and the Soviets. In many ways, this old divide and conquer strategy, if we negotiate with these nations individually, they'll be less formidable than if we try to negotiate with them as a bloc. That's what Nixon and his advisors like Kissinger believe.
Sure. And it's at the same time that Nixon is also reaching out to the Soviets and talking arms reduction. This will lead to the famous SALT agreements, or strategic arms limitation talks. You see, to Nixon and Kissinger, ideology was inconsequential. They believed that these communist nations would act in their own national self-interest, and, obviously, it would be in the best interest of both the Soviets and the Chinese not to see nuclear strikes and to limit the building of additional weapons. So this becomes the Nixon version of détente. I'm getting a little ahead of our discussion, but keep in mind that this viewpoint about ideology being unimportant will be especially vilified by a later Republican president named Ronald Reagan.
Oh boy, I love a good teaser.
Yeah.
So when Nixon has to unceremoniously resign from the presidency because of Watergate, what happens to this détente, this new approach to foreign policy with the communist nations?
Well, Nixon might be gone, but Henry Kissinger is still working in Ford's White House, and détente is very much on the table for Gerald Ford. In fact, it's during Ford's presidency that the so-called Helsinki Accords are signed in August of 1975.
And by the way, we mentioned a couple of documents. Just so you know, in the notes section of our podcast on our YouTube channel, you're going to find a link to all of these documents. So take a look at those when you get the chance. Okay? Well, those Helsinki Accords that Zach just highlighted were signed by 35 countries. And in many ways, they read like a 14 points UN Charter, UN Declaration of Rights, all wrapped into one. The signatory countries agreed to refrain from using force to pursue national goals. They all agreed to territorial integrity of other states, the non-intervention of internal affairs by other nations, and respect for human rights and freedoms. It really desired to establish a kind of new normal, and it will be a very important set of standards in the post-Cold War decade of the 90s, but it seemed a little bit hopeful and presumptive for 1975 with still so much unsettled. Still, we have to give everybody an A for effort on this one, right?
Well, not everyone was so positive. We'd be remiss if we didn't highlight that all throughout Nixon and Ford's presidency, there was criticism of this détente approach. Senator John Ashford famously critiqued the policy, calling it a smokescreen and a set of immoral policies. To him and other hardliners, this is all talk that the Soviets are not going to follow up with any meaningful action.
You know, Zags, I'd like to pick up on that notion of morality, because when Jimmy Carter comes into the White House after defeating Ford in 1976, that's what he will try to bring to this policy of détente. Disarmament will be a continued theme, but Carter's focus will be on human rights throughout the world, something he believes was missing from that, what came to be known as the realpolitik of Nixon, Ford, and Kissinger. In a speech Carter made soon after assuming office, he says that America has, quote, acquired a more mature perspective on the problems of the world. It is a perspective that recognizes the fact that we alone do not have all the answers to the world's problems, close quote. Carter projects this image of America as kind of first among equals instead of the superpower. And in his outreach to the Soviets over the succeeding weeks and months, he very clearly tries to make a personal connection with Soviet leader Brezhnev, encouraging the Soviets to use their influence and power for the good of the world as well.
Carter's going to face criticism for being overly optimistic. Some even say naive. He makes a particularly problematic statement in a commencement address at Notre Dame University in 1977, in which he says, quote, being confident of our own future, we are now free of that inordinate fear of communism, which once led to us to embrace any dictator who joined us in that fear. I'm glad that's being changed, close quote. Carter seems to declare that the Soviet threat, the communist threat, is over, when most Americans are not ready to dismiss that concern. When the Soviets invade Afghanistan in 1979, violating both the principles of the UN and those previously mentioned in the Helsinki Accords, it makes Carter look foolish for not seeing the Soviets' true intentions.
Right, and in the 1980 presidential race, Ronald Reagan is going to make him pay for that poor judgment or overstatement or naivete, whatever we want to call it. Reagan actually goes into the campaign with a pretty hawkish reputation. He embraces the sentiment of John Ashford, who Zags previously mentioned, and doesn't believe that you can remove the immorality of the communists, and specifically the Soviets, from any policy decisions that are being made.
In this regard, Reagan seems to have a better sense of the American people's views than Carter does. When you couple this perceived weakness on the communists with the 1979 revolution in Iran and the ongoing economic problems, it's no wonder that Reagan handily beats Carter in the 1980 election. And later on that year is why the United States was so compelled to beat the Soviets. It was such a major victory for the Miracle on Ice team in Lake Placid.
Absolutely. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that, of course, it's also the invasion in Afghanistan that really, sets Carter up to look foolish as well, right? Ironically, by November of 1980, Carter has himself actually abandoned this idea that you can work with the Soviets. He enacts a grain embargo in January of 1980, talking about Olympics. He actually boycotts the Moscow Summer Games in 80. Yes, he does. But it's too little too late at that point for Carter from the point of view of his political detractors. His reversal is seen only as confirmation that Reagan was right and Carter's judgment is not to be trusted.
Well, that seems like a good place to call a timeout, doesn't it, Mr. O'Hagan?
Yeah, it certainly does.
Listeners, don't forget to pick up our next podcast on détente where we address the Reagan years. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to check out all the great videos, content spotlights, a Push on the Road segment, and spectacular podcasts on this YouTube channel. We'll catch you next time on the U.S. History Underground.
Détente Part 2 coming up. Underground Army,